Hello, my name is Henry Farini. I'm the director of the Gloucester Writers Center, and I wanted to thank you for joining our ongoing series of interviews and discussions about writers and writing. This poet's library, Charles Olsen's library, has over 5,000 volumes. And it was the labor of Olsen scholar Ralph Mott, who collected all these books that Olsen read, he wrote about, or talked about. And the library is open by appointment, and we hope you'll come to explore. But today I'm happy to bring together an old friend and a new one, both who have been using the Mott Olsen Library as a resource for their research. I'll introduce Peter. He came to the library in the fall of 2019 to check it out. And today he's our writer in residence at the Gloucester Writers Center over at 126 East Main Street. Peter's a documentary and narrative filmmaker and writer. He works on public issues as a journalist and in public policy on both US and international projects. At the MOL, he was working on a drama set at the lead up to the Civil War when Frederick Douglass abandons hope of a moral political solution to ending slavery and concludes that war is the only way to resolve the crisis and end the nation's embrace of inequality. These themes figure throughout Almond's background in community organizing and policy around community control, initiatives framed by power to communities suffering injustice. Now, Greg is an old friend from Gloucester, and after college, during the Vietnam War, Greg made a bold move. He joined the Navy. And there he was lucky enough to spend a great deal of his service time reading. And books finally became his trade, both buying them and selling them and writing them. He's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, Gone Boy, A Walkabout, which is an investigation into the random murder of his 18-year-old son, Galan, at a small New England college. Demon of the Waters is the true story of the mutiny of the Whaleship Globe. And Hubert's Freaks tells a tale of a gifted and troubled book dealer who finds a stash of unknown DeeAnn Arbus photos, which propels him into a battle with the art world. Greg also has a crime novel called The Old Turk Slowed. He was a founding board member of the Gloucester Writers Center, and he sits on the steering committee of this library. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Peter.
Hi, Greg. Good to meet you virtually across the Olsen table, which you use, I know, at least once a week, probably a lot more than that. But I'm anxious to know about your Olsen project. I'll share with you mine, but I'll tell you where I would love to start. Early, you and I've had an email correspondence, and in an early one, you shared an anecdote. It's kind of it's more like a narrative, mini narrative about searching in the area known as Dogtown for you non-Cape Ann residents. I think Greg can explain Dogtown, which was hugely important to Charles Olsen, and it's hugely important in the history of Cape Ann, Gloucester, and so forth. So if that anecdote about searching in Dogtown relates to your work here at Mott Olsen currently, I'd love to hear how they dovetail and about both.
Sure thing. And I would characterize it play as much as work, because basically what I'm doing in the Mott Olsen Library right now, and what that whole narrative that you referred to is basically nothing more than an old man's folly. You get to a certain age and you're free. You've got nothing to prove. You got little to lose except what you're ultimately going to lose, and damn soon. So it opens up a certain kind of vista that I don't think is available to people at other times in their lives. The story to which you refer, I think, is, Jesus, a tough one to start. I guess I would start by saying every year we have a little foundation, a little 501c3 dedicated to the name of my son, and we raise money, and we use that money to help educate people about gun violence and how to prevent it, and also to assist survivors of gun violence financially and however else money can afford. And one of the major ways we raise money for this is every year I take a piece of writing that I've done over the year and put it in a little sort of pamphlet or a little book. I've done also a couple of books, and I send them around to people on my mailing list who I know are sympathetic to the cause and interested in what I'm working on, and this becomes a fundraising device. Well, last year I didn't really have anything in particular, but it just dawned on me at the very last minute that back in the year 2000, I had put a lot of work into a proposal for a book on Dogtown that I was unable to sell, or my agent was unable to sell, I should say. So I went back and sort of cannibalized that and made a little book about my early experience with Dogtown and Charles Olsen and Nathaniel Southgate Shaler and all these characters, James Mary, who inhabit the legends of Dogtown, which, as you referred to, is a 6,000-acre tract of wilderness in the center of the peninsula of Cape Ann. So when you're coming into Logan Airport and you have to circle around Cape Ann, if it's a nice clear afternoon,
Right.
you look down and you see settlement all along the coast of Cape Ann, and then in the middle is just trees, because that's basically what it is. That's Dogtown, and it was many things over the years to many people, but it's been here as long as we have. It plays an intimate part in the history of Gloucester. So I published this little book about Dogtown. I sent it out to friends and supporters, and I get a letter from the poet Ed Sanders,
Oh yeah,
known perhaps best as the leader of the Fugs, the
right.
alt folk band of the 60s, but also a great poet and a friend of Charles Olsen's and a supporter of the Gloucester Writers Center. He writes me a letter and he says, "Geez, Gregor, thanks for sending the pamphlet. It's really helped me see Dogtown in a different way." And as a token of his appreciation, he sends me a poem about his visit to Charles Olsen and Dogtown in 1966, in which Olsen takes him around to a couple of the legendary sites of Dogtown, specifically one where a guy named James Mary was killed by a bull. That's a famous Dogtown legend. Much like Milo, Mary was supposed to have wrestled this bull since it was a calf, and one day the bull got too strong and killed him.
Right.
Basically the story. So, and we have the site of the event. It's marked in stone in Dogtown. So Olsen takes Sanders there, and then takes him down to an orchard where he shows Sanders a tree on which he's fixed a board that he uses as his outdoor writing desk in Dogtown. And this is where he's composed many of the poems that fill up the middle of his 3-volume epic series Maximus poems. This is specifically and confusingly called Maximus 4, 5, and 6. So anyway, I say, man, wouldn't it be fun to go find that apple tree writing desk and take a picture of it and send it back to Ed? And this leads down a rabbit hole that I won't even begin to try to sketch out for you in this limited forum we have here. But it basically turns out to be a multiple biography of Charles Olsen, Don Allen, Leroy Jones, later known as Amory Baraka, Philip Whalen, Michael McClure, and Ed Sanders, and me.
Nice.
Basically what happens, what I discover is in 1959, the editor Donald Allen, who's about to publish within months the New American Poetry, which basically formalizes and identifies the next generation of poets, of whom Olsen is the leadoff, the leadoff batter, the number one in the book. Allen and Leroy Jones and Michael McClure come up to Gloucester to visit Olsen. He takes them to Dogtown, shows them where Mary is killed by the bull, takes them down to his orchard, and again, shows them how he used his writing desk. This is 7 years before Sanders, but the same trip, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
The interesting thing about this is that very night, these guys leave. That very night, he goes home and knocks off in one blast Maximus from Dogtown 1, which is a superb poem that launches this middle volume of his 3-volume epic. He's turned his back on the sea. He's got all this mythology, all this cosmography, all these legends and myths and stories that apply to Dogtown. Unlike much of what Olsen writes, the average person, me, could actually understand this poem. It's very comprehensible. There's a lot of deep themes running through it that characterize the rest of the poem, but you read the damn thing and you say, holy smokes, that's fantastic. In fact, it was such a successful poem, it was published in a separate volume by Auerhahn Press, and that's how Ed Sanders, 7 years later, sees it, becomes familiar with the poem. Anyway, all of a sudden I'm thinking, what was it about the 2 years that Olsen had spent in Gloucester, reading, studying, delving into all this stuff, not publishing much at all, certainly not working on his epic. He's just had the first volume published. He's spending 2 years sort of suspended in space doing this research. Don Allen and Leroy Jones come to visit him. That very night, he writes the poem that kicks off the whole thing. Not only that, it's the start of a month-long run that fills up the first part of the Maximus poems. And I'm like, well, what was it about Don Allen and Dogtown and this legend of Mary and the bull and this writing desk? And what is it about Dogtown? And what is it about poetry? And I start looking back on my own life and thinking, realizing the degree to which all this stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s has actually had an influence on me as a writer, but as a person, as a human, as in terms of the values that I hold, in terms of the things that I think about, in terms of the way I see things. What the hell is going on? So I've got a great resource there. I've got the Maud Olsen Library, in which I can look at everything that Olsen was reading in those 2 years. You know, Butterick's Guide identifies the sources. Sanders has identified the sources. Olsen himself identifies the sources. I can just go to that shelf, pick the book out, and look at the notes that Olsen himself has made in the damn book. Not only that, his correspondence with Don Allen, his correspondence with Ed Sanders. It's all in the supplementary material supplied by people like Ralph Maud, who assembled the library. So to me, it's like going to a park or a playground and just playing around with the materials that determined, in some measure, the person that I am.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't call it work. And yeah, it might be a book proposal, or it might be next year's pamphlet that I sent out for a fundraiser, or I might just spend the rest of my life trying to figure this thing out. But I've got, the point is, I've got the Maud Olsen Library to do it in, and God, it's a wonderful resource.
Yeah. So just to specify that search, is it true that the table was actually in a tree, and he had, the legend goes, Olsen had put it up there to be fully, because he was so tall, to be out of people's way? I mean, or what? Give us the background on why the table was in a tree.
Well, this is a lovely thing. It was in a tree because when Olsen's walking around with his pen and a piece of paper, it's kind of hard to do this while you're walking around. So he needed a place to just, okay, I remember this, just put a piece of paper down and make a note.
Right.
Sanders, who was an Egyptologist and is still really into glyphs and hieroglyphics, was kind enough in the poem that he sent to me to include a sort of schematic drawing of what this desk looked like. And Olsen himself, in a later poem, talks about when Don Allen and Leroy Jones came to visit him, and he showed him the desk, and he picked up an apple branch and showed them how he used it to write. It was just a matter of convenience for him. The punchline to this story is that this happens, 60 years ago. Yeah. And in the natural succession of growth in a wild area such as Dogtown has been for the last 60 years easily, if it was an orchard in 1966, it sure as hell isn't an orchard now. It's just a tangled jungle of succession growth between open field and mature forest. It's catbrier, it's wild apples, it's different, all just impenetrable stuff. And of course, if that desk was ever there, it sure as hell isn't there 60 years later, or if it was, it'd be up in a tree 20 feet above the ground.
Right, I see.
And we looked, there's no desk. The desk is a MacGuffin. The desk is just a sort of idea that is at the center of this crazy search that I'm on, or crazy, whatever the hell.
But it's a perfect metaphor for your exploration. I mean, you're sort of working through that tangle where you connect to Olsen and how that then brings you into your own experience and existence and why you do the work you do.
Well, that's I couldn't have said that better myself. I should be writing this down. I hope Henry's recording it.
It's being recorded.
That's good.
No,
You're
really.
up, Peter. What's going on?
Well, my Olsen connection kind of correlates to what you're going for. In this respect, I'm fascinated by his depth engagement with Gloucester. And I've been trying to think about how this comes about. And I remember, I'm going to paraphrase and mess it up, but in Maximus to Himself, which is one of my favorite Olsen poems, he says something like, I came to my ultimate craft quite late. I think he's referring to his, being rector of Black Mountain and being in the OW, in the Office of War, being in politics and PR. He
says, I'm not a fisherman, but even the thing I came to, I was slow to get there.
Exactly, late, yeah. And so what he came to as his subject and his sort of purpose was finding in Gloucester polis, as Henry has shown us in his film about Charles Olsen, place. He's obsessed. So in his letters to the editor of the newspaper, he's writing these epic blast type poems. Today we call it a blast, I guess. And he's about trying to correct, protect, preserve, fight for this place. It's as if he's found his subject and his craft here, and now he's watching around him details erode, and he just so passionate and obscure. I'm thinking to myself, they publish these letters, and he presents some of the stuff to the town council, and they're trying to understand, as you have acknowledged, a pretty obscure poet writing these passionate screams, he calls some of them, about taking the cut out of Western Avenue. These details it's like his right arm is being cut off if this happens. And so I am very interested in how communities of people in towns or ethnic groups or racial groups define themselves and express their concern. And So this interplay between Olsen, the epic poet and pathbreaker, and Gloucester and Dogtown and and the way he goes into history. I actually made a point about what he does from his Call Me Ishmael. I know you know this too, but his description of Melville had a way of reaching back through time until he got history pushed back so far he turned time into space. So he's so engaged with the moment. So history to him is like happening in your face when he sees a house about to be knocked down for a CVS or whatever they put in. So that work, that haunted pursuit of place that takes all of Maximus, that figures in his letters, and even maybe, and I wanted to ask you your impression. I've talked with Henry a few times about why Olsen left, and there's this sort of idea that he quit on Gloucester, or Gloucester quit on him. And he left to go down to stores in what turned out to be the last year of his life, where he was diagnosed, and then the end came. I had this idea that he finished Maximus. He was in such pain about what he perceived was sort of being eroded here of this place of such importance, that he almost had to abandon the town because he felt it was abandoning him. And maybe the artist, sort of finishing his work. The work of Maximus, that he can't stay any longer. He has to turn his back on it. He has to really abandon it and go on his way. And then then life intervenes, so to speak, or death intervenes. Anyway, that's what that's very abstract of the kinds of issues in Olsen that like you, I can wander through these shelves here at Maud Olsen and kind of pluck what, where did he, I mean, first of all, his intellect and range of grasp of classics, of history, of local detail. He can recall anecdotes from age 4, sitting down on the rocks with fishermen. And yet he can go to Herodotus and so forth. So that I'm ranging around Olsen's head, I suppose, supplemented by this wonderful and quite unusual collection. It reminds me of what he did with Melville that turned into Call Me Ishmael. He became the authority on Melville's influences. He tracked down everything that Melville was reading when he wrote Moby Dick. And
that's a fascinating hook you put on the end of it. And geez, I hadn't thought about that for a long while. As I recall from what I knew from people who knew him of his biography, yeah, at the end, he was disgusted with Gloucester, somehow fed up with this scene. Known to me, I mean, he writes in letters, people report phone calls in the middle of the night where he says, I just can't take it here anymore, I gotta get up. But I never thought to ask, as you very sensibly have right off the bat, what? Why? What was going through his head? I mean, in a way, yeah, he had finished 4, 5, and 6, but he was still walking around having the thoughts and composing the poems that make up the 3rd volume of this epic, published posthumously, which is the most spiritual of the 3 volumes. And he's just sort of nakedly addressing his soul and his condition, and you can feel his pain manifestly. His wife has died. He's alone in Gloucester. He's broke. He knows he's getting sick. He fears he will die. There's all this not good stuff happening, and somehow it's associated with this feeling he has that I've got to get out of this place. This place is killing me. And how you get from where you were saying at the beginning he was to where he was when he fled to stores, boy, that's a fascinating question. And it occurs to me while we're talking, we should point out to people, in case they don't know, that this Maud Olsen library is a replication of not Olsen's physical library, but Olsen's theoretical library, in the sense that it contains every book that that Maud was able to find out that he consulted. Not only that, but Olsen was a chronic defacer of books. To him, these texts were just like more writing paper with notes already on them that he could add his notes to. And in many cases, he's having a conversation with the author. You know, there's a slash through a line and he says, "You're full of shit. This can't happen." All this kind of stuff, this intense engagement with the material. These books are, the original books that Olsen had were heavily marked by Olsen. And Maud's great accomplishment was to spend the thousands of hours that it took not only to gather these books, but to transcribe every one of Olsen's notes on every page of every one of these thousands of books. I mean, it's a lifetime of effort. It's a monumental job. And, you know, we're the beneficiaries of this.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine the persistence that it took Ralph Maud to accomplish this. In any event, I think your question is a fascinating one. I haven't even thought about it. I have no ideas. That you seem to think that it was perhaps because it was almost as if he had finished his poetic work in Gloucester and then wanted out.
You know, I think the point is that it is profoundly stimulating to try to grasp, because on the one hand, he found his home here, where he committed to it. It was a childhood kind of summer home that he rediscovers and situates himself here, and clearly adores and thoroughly enjoys his interaction with the real working people of Gloucester. I mean, he even goes out on the boats, but he just loves the lore of the fishermen and the life, because that takes him back to origins. I mean, he's constantly pushing back to where this all started. So he's deeply involved with kind of the democracy, small d, of Gloucester, which he, as a public official, had been in. I mean, he had a real consciousness from his work in politics and his work during World War II on the Office of War Information Propaganda stuff. So he had a kind of consciousness of the polis, of the place and its political culture, as it were, and he was devoted to it. And I think, you know, how many defeats can you take if you're that devoted to something, and they keep knocking out? He almost describes it like a tooth being pulled, you know, when out goes a house. And he knows not only the house since he's lived there in town, but he knows it through history. He gives you chapter and verse of who lived there, when they settled it, how they made their money, and who now is just willy-nilly knocking it down. You bankers, he's tough. And I think at a certain point you get so pained by seeing your soul ripped this way and that, the way he interacts with the place, that maybe he retreated. You know, he had this friend Charles Beer down in Stores. Maybe he thought there's a job, if, as you say, he was broke at that point, potentially, and he did get a job through the department there finally.
Right. His acolytes had sort of centered in the University of Connecticut, and he relied on them to provide his literary executor, to get him a job, to provide his main scholars who preserved his work. Yeah, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking, what do we call that now? It's like burnout. It's almost as if he burned out on this massive, intense relationship that he had with this place and the job that he set himself to bring it forward, to define it, to understand it. Burned out. I just never occurred to me, but yeah, maybe.
There's in one of his letters to Maximus to Gloucester, that collection, he gets into the whole history of the so-called commons, the Gloucester, the common land, in which Dogtown is the prime, the jewel.
Also known as Dogtown Commons, by the way.
Yeah.
Central pasture is Dogtown Commons.
And I've asked, you know, I've wandered around town. I lived out towards the wooden footbridge originally when I got here. So I was quite interested in how all those meadows became reservations that are, you know, owned by the people who live around there. And sure enough, there's a letter from Olsen to the paper saying, these commons belong to all of us, and now they've been turned into reservations owned by the local homeowners. You know, he's tracking everything, and that idea that it's such a beautiful idea that Gloucester gave everybody in town 6 acres of land, and then the rest of it was for common grazing, common agriculture, or just open land like the Dogtown Commons and the meadow down at Cambridge Beach or all over town. So he was on everybody's case.
Well, you know, it's kind of an irony that part of this commons procedure that happened in the mid 18th century was they divided it up into woodlots, these narrow strips of land that ran into Dogtown that the landed settlers, some hundreds of them, each got their woodlot. And that's the very thing that makes it virtually impossible now to do the title search to find out who actually owns hunks of this land that should be in the public trust, but we can't get the people who technically, or the families who technically own it, to sign off on to sign it over to Gloucester because we can't figure it out.
Oh,
it's just it's a bizarre situation.
You know, in my own work, which I've discussed with Henry Farini and figures in another one of these Zoom discussions we're planning on the issue of race in the aftermath of George Floyd. I've done a lot of work on the period immediately after the end of the Civil War. It actually happens just months before Appomattox, when Sherman issues the famous 40 acres and a mule. It's called Field Order Number 15, and 40,000 freed people, formerly enslaved people, overnight race out to the low country and sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and they begin farming. That's, you know, they told Sherman in a remarkable colloquy between Sherman and several freed people in a kind of military hearing. Stanton, the Secretary of War, and Sherman asked them, well, what do you want in freedom? And they say, we want land to farm and till and have for our own, and we want to be left alone, meaning by our former enslavers and the plantation. And it begins. And the same problem now exists when we get into reparations and how to compensate. Nobody, you couldn't go back and figure out which families held which little pieces of, and it was taken away from them within 8 months because Lincoln, of course, was dead, and Andrew Johnson, who was a white supremacist Southerner, he made sure that all that land was taken back from the settlers, the black settlers and given back to the former owners. So, but you get this sort of murk of who owned what and when, if you're trying to somehow make good on all of that. And I know it's a
Olsen
stretch.
calls it the music racket of ownership, right? I mean, the very idea that one owns this cosmic gift is, in his eyes, something to be challenged.
Right. And he has this devotion, which we find kind of explained around the library here, to the origin and experience of each of these properties through time. They aren't just a building and a quaint, early 19th century, whatever. They are to him civilization. It's how we settled, how we collaborated, how we lived together, fishing or farming, but we coexisted, I think. And I think back to that point of what got him down at the end, as he saw that eroding, and all of his screams to the editor couldn't stem it, that, at a certain point you wear out. Maybe he, had his health not intervened, he might have had a kind of sabbatical down in the stores and come back renewed. Well, that you're trying to figure out where he ended up.
Well, I think anybody who's ever been a writer in any serious capacity shares the shock and disbelief and difficulty of comprehending the fact that you write something that expresses a strong belief of yours, and you do a good job writing it, and you're just amazed and appalled that what you said doesn't seem to make a bit of difference to anybody. All this work we put into this stuff, people just go on in their own self-absorbed lives. I mean, there's a lot of that, and it's not just particular to Olsen. Anybody who's ever written anything for cause has to be astonished at the amazing lack of penetration into the American culture. How does somebody get to be Allen Ginsberg? I don't know. It's like surfing, somebody catches the wave and off he goes, and his word is gospel. The rest of us are down there working in the mines, and our products are not being used in the same way.
But you're
it's a shock to any writer.
But you're back at it. I mean, you're making this exploration that brings you here to Maud Olsen. You found another topic that you're going to kind of track and create.
I'm an old man. I'm as burned out as Frederick Douglass or Charles Olsen. I'm doing this to keep myself alive. This is my recreation. This is my recreation.
Yeah.
And it may not even go anywhere. I just have this wonderful resource to play in.
I think on this point of futility and despair, which you have kind of hinted at.
The writer's friends and companions, yes.
But in the sense that every writer, every character in every writer's work is really some kind of extension of himself. Would you? Or some
I can imagine a condition in which that circumstance would hold. I'm not sure it's a universal truth, but.
Yeah. Okay, well, I found in this comment that way back early in his life, when he's writing his PhD dissertation that turned into this Call Me Ishmael, he's talking about Whitman, and that Whitman identifies himself with the people, and he's more of the poet than Melville. But he says Melville had the will. He was homeless in his land, his society, his self. And I read that again recently, and on this question of where was Olsen towards the end of his effort. And I wonder if that's how he felt, homeless in the place that had been so profoundly his place, his home, his polis.
A really interesting thought. I think it's a good place to take off from right there.